I'm Dan Pawlowski. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. Today's guest is the all-around gem of a human, award-winning #1 New York Times bestselling author, Libba Bray. I've known Libba for well over a decade now, and every time I'm lucky enough to speak with her, I end up feeling giddy and slightly dizzy. Which may or may not sound like a good thing, but I assure you it is. And she is. Good, that is. I feel incredibly lucky to know her, and I feel unbelievably lucky that she agreed to talk about her fears and one classic horror film with me here today. Libba is the creator of many books for young adults, including A Great and Terrible Beauty and the rest of the Gemma Doyle trilogy, as well as Beauty Queens, The Diviners Quartet, and the American Library Association's Prince Award-winning Going Bovine, which is a madcap retelling of Don Quixote from the perspective of a teen boy suffering from the human variant of mad cow disease as he escapes from his hospital bed and goes on a road trip across America to find a cure. Along the way, he fights giant fire monsters, wizards, and a particularly creepy American cult that worships happiness. I know, it's wild, and it's as gobsmackingly funny as it is heart-shattering. The fear that Libba brought to the table for this conversation comes from Rosemary's Baby, the 1968 film by Roman Polanski, based on Ira Levin's novel about, spoilers, a newly married couple's run-in with a coven of Satanists while living in a grand old apartment building on New York City's Central Park West. The movie stars Mia Farrow, John Cassavetes, Ruth Gordon, and Sidney Blackmer. I won't say much more about where we go with this, except that the film is a remarkable and horrifying artifact of how history continues to repeat itself. Before we get into it, if you're listening with kids to this one, you might want to use discretion. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore our first fears. Hi, Libba Bray.
Hello, Dan Pawlowski. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm so happy that you've decided to come and talk about your first fears with me today.
I love to talk about my fears. I usually have to pay $200 a week for that, but it's nice that you're letting me do it for free. Thanks.
That's what I'm here for. So for those listeners who, and I don't know who they could be, but who aren't quite familiar with your work, can you...
How dare
I
they?
know. How dare you?
How
Listeners,
dare.
get on board. This is the legend, Libba Bray, who I have to say, I discovered your first book. I don't know if it was your first book, but it was your first book, A Great and Terrible Beauty, when I first moved to New York City. And I didn't know you at the time, and I read it, and I just was like, whoa, this imagination, this storytelling, I love it. I love it. So when I got to meet you, I kind of was speechless, and I kind of just fudged the bed. You know, I don't think I said a word to you.
That's the blurb, the cover blurb I've been looking for. I read this, I met her, I fudged the bed. Thank you, Dan. My work here on earth is complete.
I don't know if I'm going to get through
Thank
this
you, darling.
interview with you. Okay. So can you tell our listeners,
About fudging the bed?
About fudging the bed.
Sure I could.
Can you tell them
Kids,
about...
If you ever said, no, I can have one more vodka, and the next morning you find out, no, I can't.
This was a bad idea. Now I'm realizing this is going to be difficult. Libba.
Oh, give it to them fully, Dan. Like, let's just have the full experience. Speaking of horror, strap the fuck in, people.
Libba, can you tell our listeners what your relationship to the horror genre was, is, and might be in the future?
Oh my God. I am an absolute horror nut. It is my beloved It is my genre of choice. And I fell in love with horror early on. Well, I mean, I'm tempted to say that the first horror stories that I ever remember were Bible stories because, when there's some kind of elder God who can turn people to pillars of salt or
Mhm.
says to Abraham, sacrifice your son for me. Nah,
Just
just
kidding.
funsies, just kidding. That's terrifying when you're a kid. But the first horror I remember falling in love with was Hammer horror.
Mhm.
And for those who are not familiar with Hammer horror, Hammer was a studio in England, and I think they filmed at might even filmed at Bray Studios, which of course made me feel that I was invested.
Of course.
And but they were these wonderfully anachronistic movies in which it would be like a retelling of Dracula. There'd be 14 different retellings of Dracula, like Dracula goes to the supermarket, Dracula's axe under his bed. And but it was, they'd be set in the 1800s, but the women would all look like they just came off of Carnaby Street. They'd have
Hmm.
beehives
Mm.
and winged eyeliner. So they were glamorous.
Super
And so
glam.
it was this mix of horror and sexuality and sensuality. And even 5-year-old me was like, oh, hey,
Yeah.
I'm into this. And fashion.
It intrigued you. Yeah,
It did. It
I
intrigued me
hear
and
you.
terrified me and thrilled me. I mean, and between that and I used to get horror comics when we would go to the Woolworths or something like that. I'd be able to pick up these horror comics and I would read them. And I'm sure my mother had no idea the lurid stuff that was in there. And I, of course, was enchanted. Oh, wow, look at that. Beheadings.
Were you talking
Um,
about like the EC comics, like Tales from the
yes.
Crypt and yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think it was EC, maybe even Creepy.
Hmm.
It was so
Oh,
long
creepy,
ago, but
right. Yeah.
the one that for some reason really sticks with me was there was one about with Visigoths. Because first of all, the name alone sounded like a monster to me,
Hmm.
and that the Visigoths were invading, and there was something about a monster and beheadings and some kind of curse. And so, in a way, it combined everything that I love, both of those things, Hammer horror and that comic. It's history, and uh, it's bloody and it's scary, and then there's curses, and there's also repressed sexuality
Hmm.
and not so repressed sexuality.
Oh
So
yeah.
all of that stuff was catnip to me. I
Same.
was a strange child.
Oh, I can relate. I remember going into the Walden's books in the mall when I was a kid, and I don't know why my parents bought these for me, but they were the reissue of the EC comics. There were Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and there was a third one, something of fear, and those were the comics that were banned in the 50s by the government, forcing that publisher to create Mad Magazine, which was fascinating to me. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so we're gonna get into we're gonna get into all of the sexiness, the glamour, the horror, all of that stuff that comes when we talk about the movie that you chose today, Rosemary's Baby.
Yes.
But I wanted to first ask you, which I'm asking everybody. Um,
Hmm.
I should say I'm asking my guests, not just everybody on the street, because that would be weird if I were to
I would
say,
love it if that were happening.
if I were to say, do you remember the first time feeling afraid?
First time feeling afraid. I mean, I'm sure there were lots of times that I felt afraid, but for some reason, the thing that really comes to me is that I had watched, and I think I was maybe like 8 or 9. So I was right on the cusp of puberty, in getting there. And I had watched one of those Hammer horror movies. It was a Dracula with Christopher Lee.
Oh, yeah.
And he was such a sexy beast. I mean, I was just like, oh, and I found myself, really thinking about Christopher Lee. And I think that night, as I was lying in bed, I'm sure this was some kind of, uh, the beginning of some kind of Freudian thing. But I remember thinking about Christopher Lee, and then all of a sudden I got scared because I thought, what if Dracula comes and bites my neck? Metaphor. And I remember like pulling the covers all the way up, to my ears, basically, and being, absolutely terrified that this could happen, like watching my door. And it was partially open, and I just thought, oh God, Dracula's going to come and he's going to bite my neck, and I got to be on guard. So, I mean, I think there's so many levels to that
Yeah.
psychologically,
And,
but
and,
yeah, I
and
did.
like took root and like how it, affected you later on.
Yeah,
I know you're also a big fan of, or were a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
yes,
Um,
indeed.
did you like, do you think like vampires, do you think that Christopher Lee moment and that fear sort of like lingered throughout, your growing up and becoming the artist and the writer that you are now?
That's a really interesting question. And I do think that I've had a lifelong fascination with vampires. I mean, the project that I am working on now and have been working on for the past like 3 years is is a musical called the Vampire Movie Musical! Exclamation mark,
Oh my
which
God.
is like
I love that.
it's like a love letter to Rocky Horror and Phantom of the Paradise and the Midnight Movie, because the
Awesome.
Midnight Movie was such a huge part of my life as well. And I think that because vampires are metaphor for so many different social anxieties, it's everything from our sexual anxieties to, um, in some ways, metaphors for runaway greed and late stage capitalism.
Hmm.
So I feel like vampires are great stand-ins, and they're sexy in a way, so that that they rely on seduction, that you have to invite them in,
Hmm.
so that they're very manipulative in that way. And I find all of that fascinating for the interplay between the vampires and the humans, because there's got to be some part of you that is also attracted to that, and
Oh
so
yeah.
yeah, I'm very interested. Whereas I also was very I remember seeing The Wolfman with Lon Chaney, and for some reason, werewolves for me made me sad.
Hmm.
I remember feeling heartbroken for Lon Chaney, like he was so tortured. He didn't want to transform into this beast, And I just remember, and of course, I was such an animal lover too that I was like, oh, poor werewolf.
Yeah.
Come,
Yeah.
I will feed you kibble. Oh, the kibble you prefer is like a severed hand. Oh dear, that they were out of that at the Winn-Dixie.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like if you if horror makers want to up the ante or like create anxiety, all you have to do is put a dog, put an animal
yeah,
in every
exactly.
scene, and then like for people like you and I, we're just gonna worry about them. So to mix a human and a dog or a wolf,
Exactly.
absolutely. I can
Oh,
see how that would
puppy.
be effective.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that thinking about vampires again is the fact that they live forever, uh, and that actually also seems existential, and like like a very long French New Wave film, you know?
Yes.
Like,
I'm thinking
yeah, it's just another day. Smoke a cigarette. It doesn't matter. You can smoke the whole pack.
I'm thinking of those new wave movies in a whole new way now. I'm just like imagining them all just,
Right?
hanging
Uh,
around, running through
Truffaut just needs
museums,
to throw in,
fighting
he just
people in
needs
the
to throw in a
bathroom.
vampire. I would 100% watch that.
Yes.
I would
So how?
100% watch a French New Wave vampire film. I guess The Hunger feels sort of
Oh,
close, but
oh yeah, yeah. That's a favorite too.
mm.
Bowie, Hello, Deneuve,
Oof,
Sarandon.
oof.
How like it was like a moment in time.
It was.
So how do we get from vampires to Satanists?
Satan?
what
Satan.
what made you choose Rosemary's Baby as a topic of one of your first fears, something to chat about?
Well, Rosemary's Baby is not just, it's my favorite horror movie, but it's one of my favorite movies, period. And for so many reasons. I mean, I feel like I could talk about that in conjunction, speaking of Ira Levin, also with the Stepford Wives and even Midsummer, because they're all, in a way, feminist horror. And especially, I just rewatched Rosemary's Baby. And to watch it at this particular moment in time after the Dobbs decision, as we're seeing our reproductive rights just being absolutely torn away, and this oppression of women, it is fascinating and galling to watch this movie and to think about the horror of not having autonomy over your body, which is now an actual thing. You know, that's really happening. And I think, I've always been fascinated by, I grew up, I was a child in the 70s when satanic movies were having their moment. And I think maybe also having been raised in the church, although, my parents were intellectual Presbyterians who would say things like, well, transubstantiation is really just symbolism. It's not the actual body and blood. And so, it
Wow.
was,
That was
and
not
like,
my experience growing up in the Catholic Church. I was told this is actual flesh, this is actual
yeah,
blood. And I was like,
this is
there was a
a
disconnect.
Jesus wafer.
There was a disconnect there for me. And let me say, let me preface this with, if there's any listeners out there who are religious or spiritual or whatever, please understand I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I'm sure I don't want to speak for Libba, but like Libba might be trying to take something away from you. But,
I'm definitely not. I'm definitely not.
But yeah, my experience of coming away from the Catholic Church was definitely stuff like that, where I couldn't mesh it together in my head. And so it's fascinating that maybe I would have had an easier time if I had parents or a pastor who said, this is a metaphor and the metaphor is beautiful.
Well, I mean, in many ways, I was lucky because, my father was a minister, my mother was an English teacher, and so metaphor and symbolism were everywhere, which was, great when you wanted to talk about things like religion or literature, but not so helpful when you want to make toast. Like I've explained onomatopoeia and also man versus nature to this bread, and yet it still remains bread. I don't understand. Why doesn't it communicate?
The secret is heat.
But I think, yeah, to me, the idea, especially as a horror fan and kind of upping the ante, so to speak, was like, well, you might be able to, outrun a serial killer or outwit or throw garlic and a crucifix at a vampire or silver bullet for a werewolf. But how do you defeat the big D, man? It's like game over, man, to quote Bill Paxton.
Exactly. The big D.
So that to me was like, oh yeah, that's really scary.
Yeah.
But I think also that sense of conspiracy and paranoia, and the fact that it takes place in New York City, because so much horror would take place in isolated places where I think, yeah, I would never go to that cabin in the woods. P.S. That's a big nope.
You're touching on all of the things that I made little notes about. For before we go any further,
Yeah.
in case anybody is listening and they don't know what Rosemary's Baby is. So,
You've
it's a
had 55 years, people.
1968 film based on a 1967 novel by Ira Levin. Can you just give a brief synopsis of what it is we're talking about here?
Yes, absolutely. So Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse are a young married couple, and they take an apartment in the Bramford, which, by the way, is the Dakota building at 72nd and New York and Central Park
Hmm.
West in New York City, which is also where John Lennon was shot.
Hmm.
And so they take this apartment, um, and then they are, and I'm sorry, these are spoilers. Again, you've
Spoilers.
had 55 years, but I want to give a full, like, check out now if you don't want to know this. But they become involved with their next door neighbors, Minnie and Roman Castevet, this older couple. Minnie is played memorably by Ruth Gordon, who I love so much. And they are slowly drawn into really that these older people, all these older people in the building, are a coven of Satanists, and they have decided that it's time to impregnate someone and bring the Antichrist into the world. And enter Rosemary, who is, ready for that, ripe and ready for that, to have a baby, not to be, she's
Yeah.
unwittingly pulled into this.
Yeah,
Again,
she's
no
clueless.
consent.
Yeah.
Yes, and no autonomy over her body. And her husband is the one who makes the deal with the devil, so to speak, because he's an actor who has yet to find fame. And they promise him, it's a Faustian bargain. They promise him fame and fortune and everything if he'll just, let them use his wife's womb to bring the Antichrist into the world. But so much of the movie is about Rosemary and her body and the way that she is treated like a little girl in many
Oh,
ways
oh,
by
very
all of these
childlike. Yeah.
people. I mean, even the costumes. I was looking at the costumes and going, well, that's brilliant because she's often in yellow and white, which we think of as like little girl colors a lot of times.
They're the
And the
same colors.
patterns,
They're the same colors that she chooses for her baby
that's the
clothes
wallpaper.
and the wallpaper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And also, which made me think about the yellow wallpaper, which is
Mm.
the Kate Chopin, The Awakening, which is another feminist horror story.
Yeah.
And but all the dresses, and I know that baby doll dresses were sort of a trend at the time, but they're all baby doll dresses that she's in. She's in pigtails at one point. Meanwhile, when you see her amongst the one scene when you see her amongst her contemporaries, her girlfriends, they all look like women. Like they are dressed as grown women with, they are fully inhabiting themselves. So that to me was fascinating. And also the way that all the men talk about Rosemary to each other. Even her friend Hutch, who comes over, who's concerned about her appearance because she's not looking so good now that she's got the baby, gestating the baby of
And
Satan.
yeah, and she's wan and pale and in pain. Yeah, he can
And
see
everyone
that.
disregards her pain the same way
Mhm.
that the medical establishment has a long history of disregarding women's pain, saying it's all in their heads, it's just stress, here's a pill, you need to rest,
It
and
was something I noticed during the party the scene where she throws a party for her young friends rather than the elderly neighbors who've sort of taken over their
yes,
social life. And her friends, the women in the kitchen, they lock out her husband. They're like, no, we're
yep,
going to deal with this. We're going to talk about your doctor. Your doctor's ignoring your pain. You've got to find somebody else. I was super impressed. First of all, that a man wrote that scene into the
yes,
novel, and then that Polanski, who is famously problematic,
mm-hmm.
um, was able to sort of portray that moment in such an authentic way.
Yes, and Polanski is problematic, but Polanski also survived the Holocaust.
Yes.
And so the idea of someone trying to gaslight you and say, oh, this is not a problem,
Mm,
when when there are certain people who are like, no, this is a problem. I think that it feels like that. I could see how that could also, you could have some sensitivity to that.
sure. Absolutely.
But yes, and when you think about the fact that Ira Levin also wrote the Stepford Wives,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah,
which,
he was on some theme there with men, husbands in particular, gaslighting and being kind of, not kind of, but like psychotically abusive to spouses, and almost, in a way, spoiler alert for Stepford Wives, murderous.
yes, absolutely. I mean, that thinking about that scene at the end when Rosemary finally comes in and sees the baby, and Guy says to her, they promised me you wouldn't be hurt, and you haven't been really, and we're getting so much. And I wanted to stand up and cheer when she spits in
She
his face.
spits in his face.
Spits in his face, and but it's also, you think about listening to senators on Capitol Hill saying, like, well, it's not that bad, so you were raped and you're pregnant now, but like, just have the baby. You can give it up for adoption. I mean, it's just, I would classify Rosemary's Baby in many ways as body horror.
Oh, sure.
Because, I mean, when she talks about how the pain feels like a wire tightening inside of me, just the agony and the fact that yes, that it's completely disregarded and poo-pooed. And,
I
you
think
know,
about that. I think about the scene also just after the coven of Satanists drugs. Uh, Rosemary's husband, Guy.
Guy.
His name
Isn't
is
it interesting too?
Guy.
Guy.
Oh my god!
I
Just put
know.
that together. Okay, Guy. Guy.
Guy.
So Guy
I guess
arranges.
Dick was already taken.
Probably the scene after she is drugged and then visited by Mr. Satan himself, where he rapes her.
Yeah.
And she wakes up the next morning and she's like, what happened? And she's covered in scratches. And she asks him, like, what is this? And he was like, well, I didn't want to miss baby night. She was like,
Yes.
so you had sex with me anyway? And he was like, well, yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
this guy's bad news. It's bad
Yeah,
news,
it was fun in a
Rosemary.
necrophile sort of
Oh my
way.
God.
Without question, he is the true villain of the piece.
Yeah.
And the condemnation, to me, the condemnation of this sort of traditional, this marriage, really, it's not so good for women a lot of times, and that scene is so chilling to me. And John Cassavetes is the perfect actor for it because he's got a little bit of roguish charm to him. He's funny in a caustic way. And the way that he just sort of tries to play it off. And also the way that Rosemary consistently says, when he says, what's wrong? Nothing. Because women are trained to not to be angry, to think that nothing's wrong or to say that nothing's wrong and to make everything okay. And the lengths to which Rosemary goes to try to make everything seem okay, to make Guy seem okay, even though we can see that she has these moments of doubts, that he's, not paying attention to her, or that he's not so nice to her. And she just kind of is able to kind of push it aside.
Well,
And I think that, yeah,
what I saw her doing in those moments was becoming childlike. And
mm-hmm.
it's a tactic I still see people do today to survive things
Yes.
that are difficult. She doesn't want to eat the poison, the drugged mousse that her
Yeah.
neighbor made, which she says has a chalky
Chalky
undertaste. And he's like,
undertaste.
just eat it, just eat it. And she's like, okay, well, you go flip over the record. And then she dumps the rest of the mousse onto her lap, into her napkin. And he comes over and she's like, she calls him daddy.
She calls him daddy. Do
Yeah.
I get a gold star,
Like,
daddy?
oh, I see, I finished it, daddy. And like,
Right.
clearly that's not her, being infantilizing. She is using that as a tactic to get out of a situation which she knows
Yes.
could be dangerous. And I think it's fascinating that as the movie goes on, she becomes more and more childlike, until the end, until she starts to catch on. And that
Yes.
moment where she does spit in his face, I'm like, she grew up.
Well,
or she's put aside the veneer of innocent, fragile Rosemary who, can't take care of herself.
and that if she just plays along with the patriarchy will take care of her.
Mm-hmm.
She just has to play along. And she suddenly realizes, oh no, these rules weren't written to protect me. I have to protect myself
Mm-hmm.
and my child. And it is very interesting to see the steps that she goes through toward the end there. When she realizes, when she makes the decision to call Donald Blumgart, who, by the way, is voiced by Tony Curtis.
I read that, yeah.
She calls him because she suspects. Now she's doing the research, and she suspects that she's like, I'm just going to find out if he took something of his, and if he didn't, maybe this is just a crazy thought. And so
Because the taking of somebody's possessions allows the coven to curse them or put a spell on them, something like that.
right, exactly. And in the case of her friend Hutch, he came over one day, and he's the one who's putting her on the trail of like, this building has an unsavory history, and there were witches in this building, and they used to use babies in their rituals. And suddenly her husband bursts in, and then suddenly Hutch's glove is missing, and then he goes into a coma the next day, and dies. And so yes, she starts to investigate this and wants to find out. For those who don't know, there's an actor named Donald Blomgart, and he's up for a part that Guy is up for. And the first thing that the coven does, I guess, to prove good faith, is that Donald Blomgart gets the part instead of Guy, but then Donald Blomgart suddenly goes blind, and no one can understand why. And so then Guy gets the part. And so when Rosemary makes the decision to call Donald Blomgart and ask him, is it Blomgart or Baumgart? I can't remember now. But
I think it's Baumgarten.
it might be Baumgart. Yeah.
Baumgart. I'm not sure.
She calls Donald, and she asks. She says, "Oh, he has something of yours." And then Donald says, "Oh, you mean when we traded ties?" And she puts it together.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when she just like packs her suitcases and like, right, I'm getting out of here. And then she realizes when she goes to Dr. Saperstein that he's in on it, and then goes to Dr. Hill, who sells her out. But like
because he thinks she's having a psychotic break.
A psychotic break. Exactly. He thinks that she's having a psychotic break. So of course he calls the husband, and the respected Abe Saperstein, the gynecologist. But then, it's the fact that she suddenly has agency. She drops all the contents of her purse on the floor, and when the men scramble to pick it up, she leaps into the elevator that's usually operated by an elevator operator, and she takes herself up. She leaps onto the floor because she doesn't quite get the elevator right. She locks herself in the apartment and tries to call her best friend Elise. And unfortunately for her, she's A, going into labor, and B, there is a secret passageway, which we find out about really basically in one of the very first scenes, between the apartments. But
one of the scariest moments, which also, it's scary because it's kind of funny in the way that Polanski does it, is she's on the phone trying to reach her friend who's at a movie. Babysitter answers the phone, and we clearly see her lock the door, bolt it. She's had a confrontation with the men at the door and is like, get out of here, leave me alone. And then this movie's all about doorways, right? So like the way that he
Yes.
shoots it, through the doorway behind her, and she doesn't notice, you see two elderly men like tiptoeing very delicately past the
Yes.
doorway. And it's at one point like absolutely shocking and terrifying because you're like, oh no. But also like two elderly men tiptoeing through an apartment is
It's
a
also
very funny
hilarious.
image.
It is. It's that moment of like horror and absurdity, which is
which is
great.
the
But you know,
which is where this scene ends. It ends in horror and absurdity. It's like, it's scary, but it's
we're your
also like,
friends,
what?
Rosemary.
I have to say, when I was a kid, I actually don't remember the first time I watched this all the way through. This was the epitome of a film that I appreciated on many levels. However, so much of it went over my head. Did you have that kind of experience? Like how did you find this movie? Like how old were you when you discovered Rosemary's Baby, the film?
Well, it's very interesting because this is actually one of my mother's favorite movies. I
Hmm.
feel like that says a lot. Uh, how do you really feel about me, Mom? um, no, but she also loved Hitchcock. She loved suspense, but she loved Rosemary's Baby. And so I had heard about it, but I don't think I actually saw it. Oh, gosh, I honestly can't remember. I may not have seen it until I was in college
Mhm.
because it was before streaming when you could just watch
Yeah.
something any old time.
And maybe
And
even like, I'm not assuming, age for you, but like maybe even before VHS was available.
you know,
How
my
dare
younger
I?
well, I did notice that you said I read the reissues of EC Comics, and I'm like, okay, bitch, we get it. Okay, Junior. Yes, I
I've
read them
always
when they're
thought of
on
you as my big
stone
sister,
tablets.
Libba. You're my family. You're my big sister.
Thank you, darling. Um, yeah, I can't remember when I saw it for the first time. And the first time, of course, it was like, oh my God, the whole idea of like, being impregnated with the Antichrist. And maybe it was like after I'd seen The Omen, which I do remember seeing. But in subsequent viewings, I too have gotten more and more and more out of it. And of course, I watched it this week in preparation for our talk. And in this moment, I felt such rage and despair about the moment that we are in, the fight that we are having, to just watch our rights tumbling down like dominoes and to think, oh my God, it's still like this. They're still talking around us, about us, making decisions about our bodies and our lives. And we are standing there in the baby doll dress going, I don't want to wear the fucking baby doll dress. I want my body and I want my rights. And so it chilled me to the core this time, and it really hit me in a very different way. And then I went and made a contribution to Planned Parenthood. And I mean,
Good.
it did. I will say it actually. Not to say that I wasn't active in this fight before, but once I got past the rage and despair, I was like, right, it's time to kick some ass.
Yeah.
Like, Rosemary at the end. Grab the knife from the kitchen, throw the towels on the floor.
Yeah. It feels like a kind of fight that we've had before in this country, right?
Oh, yeah.
Roe versus Wade in 72, 73. Is that?
73 was Roe versus Wade. And then I think 72, 73 was also Title IX, which gave
Oh,
girls the right, to gave them the money for sports.
yeah.
And which was why I got to be in 79. I was it was the first time they had a girls cross country team.
Hmm.
I was in ninth
That's
grade,
right.
10th
You were,
grade.
yeah, you played.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and I felt like that was being in girl sports was, it was a confidence builder because you learn to work as teammates, and you're also going, speaking of bodies, it's like, holy shit, look what my body can do. This is amazing. I mean, that's how it felt in the moment, as I remember,
Yeah.
and as a teenager, it did give me confidence. But anyway, yeah, so there were all these, and Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs in like 75 or something like that. So all these things were happening just after this movie came out. And now I look at this and I think, wow.
Yeah. And the way that things swung back, there's always a conservative reaction, right? When pro- progressives make any kind of move towards what seems to be the right thing to do, like in my head seems clearly obvious, but then the
Yeah.
80s come around and we're swinging back in the other direction
Mm-hmm.
again, and then we sort of make some progress a little bit in the, I don't even want to say the 90s, because the 90s like feels like a weird dream of fake political progress. But
Yeah.
like when 2008 Obama, we really felt like things on the left were really gelling. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's about what happened in the 80s after the progress that was made in the 70s. And of course, Rosemary's Baby is taking place in the 60s before all of this.
But I hear what you're saying about when there are times of great seismic change, and you look at the 60s, which were definitely a period of seismic change. And then we've got the early 70s and the women's liberation movement. And then, of course, we going down the whole of Watergate, but we've also got Vietnam. You've got all this seismic change. And what tends to happen is that when there is great change, there are always people who feel threatened by the change and who push back against it. And the American obsession, and I know it's not just American, but there's something particular about the American obsession with safety and security and
And
the
children.
I and children, right? Like that's the embodiment somehow of like, we must save the children. Um, Whereas, my father used to say, and my father was a diehard Democrat, but he used to say that Republicans believed in life until conception, and then after that, you're on your own. And but I do feel like so. I do feel like there's a particular American fascination with safety and security, and the irony is that, of course, everybody also wants to be a millionaire. So they never. It's in some ways, it's like not paying attention to the fact that, like, yes, perhaps if we push back against corporate greed run amok, that then we would have the kind, and we had universal health care and Head Start and all of those things, and funded, programs that actually take care of children and had reasonable housing and all of those things. Then perhaps you would actually, it wouldn't be a horror story. You would actually have that kind of safety and security. And so to me, we are in a moment of a horror story right now because I think about the rights that are being pulled back. I think about the 1% getting 1%ier and people going into medical debt just because they need to like have cancer treatment. It is dystopian.
A lot of that stuff is sort of telescoped in this film. I feel like
Hmm.
it was looking forward to a time, and I really think it was a time when Satanism, that fear of the great evil, or like in how certain stories have been told about certain pizza parlors in Washington
Oh
D.C.
God.
recently, and like Satan, I'm not sure if it was as big as a fear at that time, Satanists in general at that time, as it sort of became over the next decade. And you were talking about earlier, like books and films in the 70s that were filled with devil stuff. And I think Rosemary's Baby really was a precursor to that. It opened the door for The Exorcist. It opened the door for these big blockbuster things where people realized that they had a fascination with religious horror. It's funny, like I don't want to derail a conversation, but I did want to mention like how I kind of came to this story. You know,
Yeah, tell me.
in the 80s, I grew up as Catholic, and my parents put me in CCD. And to this
Mm-hmm.
day, I still couldn't tell you what CCD stands for, but it was catechism class. And I had, when I was very young, maybe first or second grade, I had a teacher who I don't know what her deal was, but kind of cool. She would bring in these time life books about like ghosts and spirits and like the other side. And I remember her showing us pictures of haunted houses, and if you look in this window here, you can see this face, and supposedly the story is there was a little girl who died there. And all of this stuff was coming back to me as I was rewatching this film this week. Literally memories gone, and all of it started coming back to me in that CCD class. I don't remember how or why, but I think that was the first introduction I got to the Rosemary's Baby poster. That famous green image with Rosemary in
Mm-hmm.
profile, and in the foreground, this rocky, craggy mountain with a very 60s style perambulator, stroller. And
Mm-hmm.
she brought it in, and she probably wanted to talk about like the dangers of Satanism, because by that time, the satanic panic was seeded well and growing, right? And that was my first introduction to this idea of like Rosemary's Baby. What's the deal with Rosemary's Baby? Who's Rosemary? Why is she worried about her baby? Isn't that like a fun thing? Like for me, it was like the very first steps into thinking about motherhood and what a mother should do. Like I had very close relationship with my parents, and didn't really think that other people might have had different experiences. I do remember by the first time I'd seen this film, I was probably 11 years old, and I specifically remember it was on television, so some of the nudity and the sex was toned down, were cut out. And it was around Halloween time, and my parents had a TV in the basement for us in New Jersey. And I started watching this movie, and my dad came down. He was like, "What are you watching?" I was like, "I don't know. I think it's something called Rosemary's Baby." And of course, in my mind, I'm remembering that poster, and I'd always wanted to find out what was inside of that VHS box. And he was like, "I don't want you watching this." And I was like, "Oh, okay, all right." So I changed the channel. He went back upstairs, and I changed the channel back because I was like, I have to find out what's going to happen. But for me as a kid, like I said, like all of this stuff went over my head in terms of what appealed to me as a kid watching this movie that I probably shouldn't have been watching. I don't know. I disobeyed my father. So he was probably smart enough to say, "No, don't watch that," and then think that I was going to listen. But I think the things that stuck out to me, like appealed to me as a kid, was the idea of the secret passage at the end of
Yeah.
the hallway. I've always been fascinated by secret passages. The chanting that Rosemary and Guy hear through the walls, I was like, that was creepy.
That is one of the creepiest moments to me, actually.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's a New York nightmare. Having lived in close proximity in New York City
Mm-hmm.
apartments, you can hear your neighbors, and like if I'd ever heard that, I probably would have gone running. There was the image of the devil eyes, when she looks up and she's like, "This isn't a dream. This is really happening." There was that massive, incredibly gothic cradle at the very end, shrouded
Oh,
in
yeah.
that black fabric. These are the things that stuck out in my childhood brain. It really made me remember this movie, and where all the other stuff sort of was like floating around my head, these ideas that I didn't even comprehend at the time. one other thing that really stuck out was Rosemary's Panic. Mia Farrow's performance is so incredible in this movie. Like,
Yes.
she really brings this element of, like, I think it was the first time I understood the word paranoia, but also it wasn't paranoia because it was real. The dangers were real, or at least it
Mm-hmm.
felt like that. It felt like that. Maybe because the perspective we were seeing was that so tight to Rosemary's POV, right? But I also remember Ruth Gordon, right? This character,
He chose you
many
out of all the women in the world. Out of all the women in the world, he chose you to be the mother. You drink it. It's just plain old Lipton tea.
like as a
I love
child
her so much.
watching Ruth Gordon, I instantly formed a bond with her idea, the idea of her, the spirit of Ruth Gordon, and the shocking and I think very scary thing about that character to me is as it was revealed, she's this colorful, like, fashion plate, like, purple hair, very bright makeup, and at the end, like, she is a Satanist. She's worshiping Satan. I was like, that could have been my grandmother. I was like, that
Mm-hmm.
as a child was what scared me. And the other thing was the husband. The idea that the man of the household, the family, could be having one pulled over on them. And I I think I looked at my dad a little differently after I watched that movie. I was like, what secrets do you have? I know you go to work every day, but, like, what are you doing there? It really affected me. And I'm sorry I'm going on and on, but, like, I've just one more thing I want to talk about, just because in terms of our first fears and childhood fears, like, I remember a nightmare, and this is another thing that came back to me as I was watching the film. I know a lot of people don't like hearing other people's dreams, but, like, this is pertinent. I remember having this dream that I was walking through an apartment building with tight hallways that sort of jutted left and right and left and right, and the light in the hallway was red, and in each corner that the hallway turned, there was somebody just standing there looking at me. And I get into this bigger apartment and, like, sort of feel relief. It feels like, oh, this feels like a little bit more homey. It feels a little bit more safe. And I'm looking out the window, and across the street I can see, kind of rear window style, I can see everybody in their apartments across the street doing various things. And then there's this jolt of music or light, and every single person in the building across the street turns and looks at me. And I think that dream came from watching this movie. Like, I think that the ideas of the hallways and the like, the paranoia that Mia Farrow's character Rosemary feels, it sort of got in my head, and it really, really freaked me out. So
Well,
as a kid, like, these, like, it's interesting to see what these bigger, scarier, capital H horror movies can do, and the effect that they can have on you. And I'm not sure how that affected me as I grew up. It was like one nightmare, and that was fine. But yeah, that was my experience with Rosemary's Baby.
well, I of course would be very curious to know what you had been feeling when you went to sleep, what had happened that day, like when you reflect upon the dream, are you able to see I find dreams fascinating, and I'm a very vivid dreamer as well. And I wonder actually if a lot of people who love horror and write horror are vivid dreamers. And I would be curious to know like what it represents to you, like when you look at it. I have a recurring serial killer dream, and
Mm.
I'll tell you about it in a minute. But I wonder if you can look at that dream and look at the intersection with Rosemary's Baby, but also what they bring up for you, each
Mm.
one, the dream and the movie.
If I were to think about it, I probably was starting to question my sexuality at the time,
Mm,
and
gotcha.
the paranoia of the church's judgment. A parish of a congregation of people who at any time could turn, look at you with judgment or hate. I think, like, I'd never considered that before, but thank you for helping me analyze this moment because, yeah, it definitely was attached to the sort of the Catholic religious horror of Rosemary's Baby and sort of my own sort of coming to grips with the teachings that I had been given throughout my childhood that I no longer, subscribe to.
It's interesting because I could see how that movie could absolutely be a psychological representation because here are these kindly people. It's like a fellowship, right? They're your neighbors. They're looking out for you, but they could also sacrifice you to the devil. And in a way, being sort of like Rosemary, being sort of naive and trusting, and then realizing that this is not going to gel with who you need to be in order to take care of yourself. I could absolutely that it feels like something you want to believe in, and also that it's a potential threat
Mm-hmm.
to who you are as a human. And then there's also all of the stuff about wrestling with faith. And I think for many of us who grew up religious, and my father was a minister. He was also gay. He came out later in life. So there were secrets he was keeping. And of course, the church would not be accepting of that. And so it was a secret I had to keep as well once I became a teenager, which certainly colored my views on the church, not necessarily spirituality, but the church is an institution which is run by people, people are flawed. But I think for those of us who grow up in the church and who begin to question certain aspects of the teaching, that's a scary moment too, because it feels quite threatening, like, oh my God, if I renounce this teaching, what am I renouncing and what am I risking? And so the moment where they're at dinner and Roman is talking about about the Pope coming to New York.
Early on in the film. Yeah.
Yeah. And that it's like, it's just showbiz, that it's pageantry. And Rosemary is visibly upset. And Minnie says, oh, I think we're upsetting Rosemary. And she's like, well, I was raised Catholic. And she's like, well, no, I'm not sure. And all she says is, well, but he is the Pope. And so it's that caught between, like, she's like, I don't know that I'm estranged obviously from my family, and I'm not going to church. I mean, we never see her go to church. She's not wearing any religious iconography. She's not wearing a cross. There's no evidence of that. She seems very secular. But she can't quite let go. Like, well, he is the Pope. And then, of course, the famous scene when she's sitting in the doctor's office and the cover of Time magazine, which was an actual cover, says, "Is God dead?" And I think that, again, it gets down to, and I could certainly understand why, when you think about now things happen so much faster in our internet age, but it used to be that things took a little while for people to really reflect on. And you think, okay, this is 68. So it's been, 20 plus years since the end of World War II. There's been the Cold War and McCarthyism, and the Vietnam War is raging. And for the first time ever, those images are being, flashed on our nightly TV screens, because that didn't happen before. But now it was happening, and people could see what was happening. They could see the horror of it. All of those things combined with, I think, sort of with the space race, because I was a little kid. I was 5 when they landed on the moon, and we were fascinated with astronauts. But suddenly, we're going into space, which was this thing that was just abstract. And now we are like gods. We are like Prometheus. We bring fire into space. And I could see how all of those things, and then of course also, and the pill, there's a sense of like, well, we can go into space. We can control our reproductive cycles.
We don't
These
need God
horrors,
anymore.
right? These horrors happened, and God didn't step in.
Right.
God let
Right.
it happen. Um,
Yeah. So
so I,
opposite sides of the same coin. Yeah. We don't
yeah,
need God, but also God isn't there for us.
yeah, and oh God, we want to cling to God. Because I
Yeah.
mean, and what does Rosemary say at the very end when she
Oh
realizes it? Oh
God.
God, oh God.
And the
It's like
woman's
she's
response,
beseeching.
her
Yeah.
response. Do you remember?
Yes.
Shut up about your God, or we'll kill you. Even though we
Milk or
still
no
need your
milk.
milk.
Milk or no milk, we'll kill you. I know. Laura Louise, man,
Brutal.
Spitfire. But it
Brutal.
also evokes, I mean, Rosemary saying, oh God, you might as well finish that sentence. Why hast thou forsaken me?
Hmm.
I mean, so it's almost a Jesus moment,
Hmm.
you know?
It's the same line that the inspector, the detective from The Wicker Man says at the end of The Wicker
Yes.
Man. It's the same line. Oh God, oh God, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but again, what 50 years ago, something. But yeah,
But that, by the way,
and
is,
again, it's religious, religious sort of horrors. Even though God hasn't really played a role necessarily in Rosemary's character throughout this movie, it's all of a sudden like you're confronted with a great mystery, and he's there again, and you're asking for help.
yes.
you know.
And it's interesting that you brought up Wicker Man, which is also a movie I dearly love. I love folk horror, and I feel like in many ways you could look at Ari Aster's Midsummer absolutely on a line
Yeah.
with Rosemary's Baby and the Stepford Wives, and except that you know at the end of Midsummer, it's a very different kind of ending.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but I
mean,
feel
in a
like
way, like at the end of Midsummer, Florence Pugh's character kind of comes to an acceptance as well, just like Rosemary
mhm,
does. So
yes,
there
yes,
are similar in a way,
yeah,
but definitely the Wicker Man connection to Midsummer as well. It's you know it's a folk horror thing, and
yeah.
I wonder if in a way Rosemary's Baby could be considered folk horror. Just despite
It's
the
in,
fact that it's an urban horror, it's taking place in New York City. There's a lot of folk horror elements to it. The Tannis route, the secret witches who live next door. No, I don't want to call them witches because I know real witches, and
yeah,
they don't
exactly. It's
necessarily follow this
movie
dogma.
witches.
Movie witches. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, you can't talk about, you know, she has that book, all of them witches, all of the, and you
All of them
can't think
witches and
about all of them
the
witches
Scrabble
and not think
pieces.
about, yes, oh my God, that is one of my favorite scenes too.
Iconic image, yeah.
It's so good. Um, but you can't think about that, of course, without thinking about Salem in our history,
Mm.
another moment of satanic panic
Hmm.
involving women and and the patriarchy.
Oh my
And
God, it just
so
keeps
in a
going
way
back and back.
yeah, it is. Well, I always say history is a hydra, you know,
Cut
and
off the head, two more.
there's, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, that's connected to that, just connected to that, to the thigh bone. Um, but it's also, that takes it into folk horror because we're hearkening to a past. But I think even the idea of trying to hold on to the old ways. I mean,
Mm.
which is always when we think about one of the things that I'm always fascinated by with folk horror is that it's usually about people threatened by change trying to hold on to the old ways.
Mm.
And
You know what? I was thinking about that too, because in a way, Rosemary's Baby sort of turns that idea on its head. In
yes,
in
you're
that,
right.
Rosemary sees the neighbor Roman Castevet, the elderly man who's married to Ruth Gordon, and she sees that his ear is pierced, and that really
Hmm.
strikes her. And I'm like, that kind of is like a counterculture thing, right? And in the late '60s, like that was a big thing, and I'm like, are we saying like the counterculture was usually younger people trying to make change, right? And she's seeing evidence of a counterculture, maybe that once upon a time existed. Maybe the old ways were the counterculture at one time. I don't know. It's an idea that I haven't really fully fleshed out, but it was something that I thought about when I rewatched the film last night.
It is fascinating to think about because in many ways, she and Guy are not really they're not part of the counterculture and they're not about change. They're part of the bourgeoisie. I mean, that apartment, I admit, when they go in and start transforming that apartment in the Dakota, I was like, house porn, you know. But they are about, wanting to have their piece of the pie and the record on the hi-fi and the nice couch. So there's a lot about sort of just the consumerism and, they're not counterculture. And
No.
it's 68,
Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting to think about that because, yeah, you're right. It's the elderly neighbors next door who are like the outliers.
Yeah. It's an interesting turn. And I feel like we can't talk about Rosemary's Baby without sort of going into what happened the next year in Polanski's personal life.
Yes.
With the horrible crimes of the Manson family and what happened to his wife and his unborn child and a lot of their friends. Like, it's almost like
eerie. I mean, I don't,
like prescient. It's like whatever
yes.
happened. It was like, it makes an argument for like the cursed movie trope, right?
Yeah.
Did this story sort of put him on their radar or something? I don't know.
It's so, I agree. Like I saw a picture not long ago of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate on set for Rosemary's Baby. And it really it was jarring because, yeah, how can you not think about what is to come? And 69 in general, between there's Manson and LaBianca murders and Altamont, and of course 68 is the Tet Offensive, which is so it just feels like we've gone from 67 Summer of Love to to
God is
carnage.
dead.
To God is dead, exactly. Yeah. So in many ways, you're right. This movie, I mean, it feels horribly prescient in terms of Polanski's own personal tragedy, but it also feels like it's got its finger on the thrumming pulse of what is happening and what is to come in the country.
Yeah. Speaking of what is to come in the country, I want to sort of end on a happier note, maybe not a happier note, but let's talk about you, Libba. So I, having lived in New York City for nearly 20 years, from 99 to the late teens, I whenever I would go up to the Upper West Side, it always kind of felt haunted to me. And I think the Dakota had something to do with that. Some of the other pre-war buildings, the Ansonia on 73rd and Broadway, is another kind of very tall, very Gothic-looking apartment building that was the location of Single White Female. I don't know if you ever saw that one. That's where
here, buddy. Come here, buddy. Sorry, I just love to say that line.
But you have written a series or several years back called The Diviners, and a lot of that takes place on the Upper West Side. Do you feel like maybe Rosemary's Baby, these kind of creepy buildings, was there any kind of influence, New York City influence, on the story of the Diviners Quartet?
Absolutely. And on the Gemma Doyle trilogy as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, yes, the Bramford, aka the Dakota, was absolutely an influence on the apartment building that Evie and her uncle live in. I wanted to have that kind of creepy Gothic vibe. And of course, you've got the sisters upstairs, the
Oh, the
elderly
sisters.
sisters,
Which at the end of
and
book one, you do something with them that just made my skin crawl. Speaking of,
why, thank you.
putting an animal in a scene and then making me worry about them. But yeah.
And I definitely thought about everything from the Trench sisters, who were referenced in Rosemary's Baby, to Ruth Gordon. I thought about those sisters, and like I absolutely want them to be these older women who scare you a bit. What's the deal with them? And then also thinking about the Museum of Natural History, which is also a favorite building in New York. And I don't know if you've ever been to this is not on the Upper West Side, but the Morgan Library that's on Madison around 37th Street.
Yeah.
I thought about that as an influence on the Museum of Creepy Crawlies.
Oh yeah.
But that scene with the Scrabble letters where Rosemary is where Hutch has said the name is an anagram and she's trying to work it out, and then she does. I was fascinated with anagrams ever after. I was just like, I would always try to work out an anagram for something. And so in the Gemma Doyle trilogy, the second book, they have to
Genius.
figure out who somebody is. And I was like, anagram.
Yes.
So, I feel like,
incredible.
And also I think the idea of is she or isn't she, that paranoia. I mean, for me, it's impossible not to see Rosemary's Baby and be like, yes, this is, as she said, this is no dream. This is really happening. But I have no idea what it was like when it was received, when it first came out. But I could see how there could be people being like, no, it's the pregnancy doing this to her, So always leaving a certain amount of ambiguity, like, is this really happening? Is this not really happening? Until like, oh, no, it would appear that this is actually really happening. So keeping that sense of willing suspension of disbelief, maybe. But also, like, I also love a slow burn. I am not.
This is a slow burn.
This is a slow burn. This movie's like what, 2 hours and 20 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like it. And the naturalistic sense of just like, oh, now we're making coffee. Now we're looking through a recipe book. Now we're, having a sort of argument between husband and wife that could be about any number of things. But it's like a drop, drop, drop. It's like the water just keeps filling up the bucket
until it gets to your nostrils, and all of a sudden you can't breathe.
And I love that in a horror movie. I do not like, when something just is like, bam, right out of the gate. I think about something like, and I'll pull up Ari Aster again with Heredity. That's also a slow burn until you get to the middle of the movie where something so horrible happens. And you think about it, in Rosemary's Baby, it's the middle of the movie where she's impregnated by the devil. So it's like, you hit this peak and you're like, wait, what? And then, that's where things just start to really ratchet up. But I love a slow burn, man.
It's funny to think about that in terms of a child audience coming to find this movie. Like, however, however misbehaved we were watching it, like, secretly or whatever. But I'm kind of surprised that I had the wherewithal to sit down and watch this at age 11 or 12 or whenever it was, because it doesn't have the jump scares that I know kids love. I talk about jump scares versus, slower creeping eeriness in terms of when I'm talking with kids at schools and libraries or whatever, and I'm like, which do you like better? And they're always like, jump scares. But for me, there was something about this movie, and I listed the things that like appealed to me earlier, but a slow burn for a kid, I wonder if that works. Is that a thing that can happen?
I wonder.
That appeals to them.
I even wonder if it appeals to an adult audience now. You know,
Right.
because our attention spans have gotten so much shorter.
Yeah.
But I still feel like, for me, when it comes to horror, I want them to build it. I need to be sort of, I want to get progressively more anxious, and,
And you're very good at that. I mean,
oh, thank you.
your books
As are
are,
you.
oh, well, thanks. Your books are long, they're epic, and you give yourself space to drop the hints like water in a bucket slowly over time. I think that's definitely something that you are very, very good at.
Thank you. I think one of the other things that I just want to mention about horror, and I'm curious to see how you feel about this, but I think that an element of horror that is overlooked is sorrow and grief.
Mm,
There's something that is being lost, and I feel like I need to have time to really, there needs to be emotional stakes. I need to care about those characters in order for me to care that they're in danger.
mm.
And I think about how much horror, like Don't Look Now is an excellent example of horror with grief,
Family who
and
lost their daughter. Yeah.
yes, and that the sense of that is palpable and somehow makes the scary stuff scarier to me,
Yeah.
because there is that undercurrent of loss, and it reminds us that, I mean, not to be not to be morose, but it reminds us that in the end we do lose everything.
Hmm.
We lose because we have an expiration date.
Hmm.
And in some ways, horror allows us to grapple with our fears about our mortality.
Yeah, and I think that is something that kids can start to learn, understand, like
Yeah.
even on their own. Like I just saw the new Barbie movie, and she like the basically the turning point for her at the very beginning of the movie is like, do you guys ever think about death? As I'm like, oh my god, this is this
I
is
want to
not
party with her.
this is not the Barbie movie I thought I was signing up for, but give me more Greta
Oh,
Gerwig.
you should have played Barbies with me back in the day.
Yes,
And now we go
but
into the
that's why.
haunted
But
castle.
that's what I'm talking about. Like kids sort of understand that sort of inherently, whether or not they are shown it in a story or just thinking about their lives or seeing how
Yes.
things progress for the adults in their lives and losing family members or it's I agree, it's an important part of not only horror, but it's an important part of learning what it is to be human.
Yeah, I agree, and I lament that we overschedule children now, and that we're also that it seems like everything is results and upward mobility. You got to accomplish this task and this task, and you got to do this and play this sport, and all that kind of stuff. Because really, the value of boredom and play, which allows your imagination to fly and to work through in play a lot of these underlying fears and anxieties. I always said that horror is wonderful for anxious children because it allows us to project our fears onto an actual monster that can be, perhaps fought. And but also I feel like as writers, that's our job too, is to play. It's not just about, well, let me hit this mark and see if this is, I mean, yes, we'd all like to keep the lights on and eat food, and I would appreciate it if I'm not living under the carnival ride,
Hmm.
with 18 feral cats drinking my own urine to survive. But
No,
that's not why I write stories. It is also a form of play that allows me to dive into what it is to be human
hmm, I love
and to make
that.
sense of this world.
Well, listen, I've kept you much longer than I meant to, but I was just really
This is so fun.
loving
Oh my
where this
God.
conversation went, and I so appreciate you taking the time. do you want to, like, to finish, do you want to tell people about anything that you have coming up, or, or do you want to just leave it at
You
the
mean like
vampire?
lunch?
like
Like,
book wise or work
yeah,
wise,
lunch.
musical vampires wise.
Gosh, work wise, I like to work on lots of different projects at once. And so I will say the three things that are kind of at the forefront. One is the vampire movie musical, exclamation mark, that I just mentioned earlier at the top. And so writing, I've written and recorded 12 of the songs, and I'm writing the script right now. So there's that. And then there is a book that's coming out next fall, that's all about love and resistance. It has a working title. The working title is either Under the Same Stars or Love and Resistance.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not sure, but it's coming out next
I like
fall.
both of
And
them. I mean, I think they're both
thank
are
you.
very appealing.
Well, thank you.
I'm looking forward to both of those projects,
Thank
and
you. And
until
thanks for
next
having me,
time.
Dan.
Yeah, I
Also, let's get together over dinner sometime and talk folk horror, because
yeah,
that sounds like a fabulous dinner conversation.
absolutely.
And we'll just terrify all of our neighboring patrons, where we'll be at the restaurant and they'll be like, those people scare us.
That's what I like to do in restaurants. So I think that
Yeah.
sounds like a great date.
We'll have a booth to ourselves.
Listen, thank you so much, Libba.
Thank you. This was fun, Dan.
Many thanks to Libba Bray once more for suggesting this incredible film and for taking the time to rant with me about it. I loved this conversation, and I could have kept going and going. If you haven't seen Rosemary's Baby, sorry for spoiling the whole thing, but also check it out ASAP. It truly is a classic. A fun fact before we go, one thing Libba and I never got into is that Ira Levin was a self-proclaimed atheist. In his own words, he didn't even believe in the devil. And yet, the impact of his work on pop culture and culture in general is undeniable. Anyway, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And, if you like, you can follow our social media at Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What would you do if you found out your spouse had sold you out to Satanists? Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.